Good morning. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI. Delighted to have all of you with us this morning for remarks by Chairman John Kline unveiling his proposals to reauthorize NCLB or ESEA. Take your choice. It was a little over 10 years ago, of course, that President Bush dragged along a large number of recalcitrant Republicans on the Hill, and Senator Kennedy and Congressman Miller dragged along a number of recalcitrant Democrats on the Hill, and we wound up with No Child Left Behind, with massive bipartisan majorities, close to 390 votes in the House, 89 votes in the Senate. It was hailed at the time, post 9/11, as an example of being able to work across the aisle to get things done. Today, NCLB is regarded quite differently. It, of course, was due for reauthorization in 2007. It has not yet been reauthorized. Last year, testifying before Congress, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan declared 82% of America's schools could be labeled failing, and over time, the required remedies for all of them are the same, which means we will really fail to serve the students in greatest need. This past fall, President Obama declared, "Experience has taught us that in its implementation, No Child Left Behind had some serious flaws that are hurting our children instead of helping them." And last month in the State of the Union, the President declared that we must grant schools flexibility to teach with creativity and passion, to stop teaching to the test, and to replace teachers who just aren't helping kids learn. The Center for Education Policy estimates that 48% of the nation's schools failed to make adequate yearly progress in 2010-2011. That's up from 39% in 2009-2010, and the numbers are expected to keep increasing as we get towards 2014. The public itself has deep concerns about NCLB. In 2011, a USA Today Gallup poll reported that 57% of Americans say Congress should eliminate or make major revisions to NCLB, while just 21% wanted to keep it in more or less its present form. State chiefs and superintendents and secretaries of education have called for substantial changes. Last year, New Mexico Secretary of Education Hannah Skandera told Congress, while NCLB took an important step in requiring states to implement rigorous standards for all students in the state, the role of the federal government should end there. Today, in the U.S. House of Representatives, Education Chairman John Kline will be introducing two bills intended to overhaul No Child Left Behind. He is here today to talk a little bit about the content of the proposal and to take questions and explain it in more detail. Representative Kline has represented Minnesota's 2nd District in the U.S. House of Representatives since first being elected to Congress in 2002. Since 2010, he has served as chairman of the Education and Workforce Committee for the 112th Congress. A 25-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps, Representative Kline also serves on the House Armed Services Committee. During his celebrated career in the Marine Corps, he served as helicopter pilot and earned the responsibility of flying Marine One, the President's personal helicopter. He also served as a personal military aide to Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. He is here with us today to talk about his twin bills, the Student Success Act and the Encouraging Innovation and Effective Teachers Act. With that, please join me in welcoming Chairman Kline.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for inviting me. I've got some prepared notes here, which script I'm going to try to skip through. I see that AEI suffers from the same apparently worldwide shortage of teleprompters that struck a couple of 3 years ago, so sorry. Cheap shot, I know. Look, I'm going to go through some notes here, and then apparently my otherwise nearly perfect staff has signed me up to do questions and answers, so we will do that as well. No matter how often I counsel them about that, it just pops back up again. Look, let me start by asking a question that you have heard increasingly in the news. For the last year, the year before, as the subject has come up again and again, but I'd be curious to see how it plays out in this audience. And the first question is, how many of you in this room really believe that you're better off, your quality of life is better at your age than that of your parents? How many? Okay, most of you, not all of you. And then, of course, the flip of that question is, how many of you believe that the quality of life for your children or your grandchildren is going to be better than yours? Wow. Okay, some of you have done some, not nearly half, but some of you, and I'm proud of you for the work that you've done in getting them ready to go. Well, according to a poll, last year, only 44%, less than half of Americans thought that their kids would be better off than they were. And that's the first time ever in our history. It's the nature of America that we prosper and grow and that our kids are better off, will be better off than we were. We all have hope for them and have dreams for them. And clearly, seems to me, one of the reasons why we have this lowered expectation and why the chances for our kids are less than they were for us is that our schools are just not doing the job. Just not doing the job. Our children are not reading at grade level. Fewer than 4 in 10 4th and 8th grade students are proficient in math, and only 42% of U.S. high school graduates are ready for college level math. And when I talk to people in the colleges, they suggest it might be actually lower than that. There's an awful lot of remedial education that has to go on. Only 56% of African American students and 52% of Hispanic students graduate from high school. Wow, think about that. Unbelievable. No one in this room would accept such mediocrity from their child's school, but this is a reality faced by millions of Americans. And it's not for lack of trying that we're trying to get rid of this mediocrity. In the more than 4 decades since Congress established the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the federal government's role has never been bigger, as Rick teed up for us just a minute ago. But the proliferation of federal requirements and investment has yielded little evidence of improved outcomes for our children. Despite the United States spending more than $10,000 per pupil per year and tripling federal education spending since 1970, reading ability has stagnated. Achievement gaps persist, and graduation rates are no better than they were 4 decades ago. Picture any 4th grade classroom. In the typical American elementary school, you could expect to see around 16 9- and 10-year-old students. At this point, they will receive roughly 900 days of instruction at a cost to taxpayers of up to $50,000. And of these 16 children, 5 are unable to read. These aren't the statistics of some third world country. That's the record of America's schools. These are our children. So how do we make change for the better, and what role does the federal government play? Subject we've been wrestling with, I've been wrestling with since before I came to Congress, when I was in the minority, when I was in the majority, when I was in the minority, when I was in the majority again, wrestling with this problem. As a matter of principle, after 40 years of failure by the federal government, I believe decisions about education should by and large be made at the state and local level. As a matter of principle, parents should have as much information on and input to their child's education as possible. And as a matter of principle, all decisions should be measured against the yardstick of whether they're helping students learn and achieve. But since 1965, Washington has played an increasingly prominent role with little to show for it. Since passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, federal spending in education has increased every single year, and we aren't seeing results. We can't afford more top-down solutions. I know everyone in this room is familiar with the most recent iteration of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the aforementioned No Child Left Behind. signed into law in 2001. I hasten to point out I didn't arrive in Congress until 2003. Just an aside for those of you who are planning to blame me. Look, the law was, long on good intentions. And I remember after I did arrive, after it was law, and I traveled around and I talked to teachers and principals and superintendents and parents, and nobody said, oh, well, that's not a good idea. We ought to plan to leave some children behind. No, nobody said that. The goal was a good one. And I think President Bush's purpose and intention is unchallenged. But I also heard about problems. To no one's surprise, the law has failed to achieve the goal of adequate yearly progress, AYP. Every child in America reading on grade level. Simply not going to happen. The last academic year, the Center on Education Policy, as Rick said, estimates that nearly half of all schools fail to make adequate yearly progress. As Rick said, Arne Duncan projected to be 82%. Well, maybe it wasn't 82% last year, but 2014, it's supposed to be 100% of our kids on grade level. I'm sort of fearlessly forecasting we'll be close to 100% of our schools making AYP. Unless something is done, these percentages will continue to grow. At a recent hearing in our committee, a principal from Maryland acknowledged the reality, saying, quote, there is a disconnect between federal standards and what we're doing, which is really looking at individual student progress. There's a disconnect between the federal level. Leaders of all political persuasions agree the status quo is unacceptable. Secretary of Defense Arne Duncan, who was himself a superintendent in Chicago Public Schools, acknowledges No Child Left Behind has significant flaws, he says, and states and school districts need relief. But rather than work with us to get it changed, he and the president have decided to issue waivers in exchange for states adopting policies that he wants them to have. Sort of paraphrasing, he would say, we'll let you opt out of these requirements if you do things the way we want them done. And that's the waiver policy that we have right now. I understand there's going to be an exciting announcement today that states are going to be granted waivers. These states are granted waivers because they've made changes that he wanted made. Not changes that we put into law, but changes that he wanted made. George Will said it best in his Washington Post column, and here I do have to read this carefully. He says, quote, the Obama administration considers the Republican-controlled House of Representatives icky and the separation of powers tiresome, so it is dispensing with legislation in favor of coercion. Icky. Boy, it's that approval rating thing again. Icky. Wow. To make matters worse, the plan inches our nation's schools toward a rigid one-size-fits-all program that happens to be in the model that he wants. And listen, let me just an aside here. I find that Arne Duncan as a person is impossible to dislike. He is. He's a very likable guy. And I think he is very sincere in wanting to see our children succeed. But this notion that Congress is sort of an impediment to be bypassed, I find very, very troubling in many, many ways. Okay, despite all this waiver stuff, and as Rick said, we've been moving forward. We've been moving forward in sometimes a bipartisan way and sometimes not, working side by side. I was mentioning, I see some of my staff is back there. The people have been doing all the work. And so when we get to the questions and answers, when I start ducking them, I'll start calling on them, I'm sure. They worked incredibly, incredibly hard. worked with their counterparts, with George Miller's staff, trying to come to agreement and pound things out, because it's very, very hard to get things done without some bipartisan agreement. We came close on some things and couldn't come to agreement on other. So I decided to press on. We can't let this process stagnate, because waivers or no waivers, partisan or bipartisan, we have to change this law. We have to change this law. And that is one thing that there is bipartisan agreement on. We must change the law. It is not working as it was intended to work. It is getting in the way, so we're pressing on. And as Rick said, we're going to introduce the final two pieces of our comprehensive education package today. The committee will have a legislative hearing on both of our bills next Thursday, February the 16th. The Student Success Act will restore each state's authority to meet the needs of its students and schools. The bill maintains important requirements that states and school districts administer reading and math assessments and report the results disaggregated by subgroup, which gives parents important information about their kids' schools. We felt that that was critical, that you can't make decisions if you don't know what is happening. And so one of the good things that No Child Left Behind provided was this notion that you ought to disaggregate the information, break it down so you can see how each subgroup is doing. And we insist that that continue. Our bill allows states, not the federal government, to design their own accountability systems to hold schools responsible for student success. Our bill also injects reason into the nation's education system by giving school districts the freedom to use federal funds based on the needs of their own student populations. Seems that ought to be just self-evident, but amazing how hard it was to get that through. And it protects taxpayers by holding states accountable through responsible reporting requirements. The American people deserve better stewardship of their hard-earned tax dollars. Simply put, the bill challenges states and school districts to accept the reform challenge. Many states and school districts are already doing just that, and we should support and encourage those promising efforts rather than get in their way. Another area of current education policy that must be addressed is how we measure and reward effective teachers. We can all agree that every child deserves to be inspired by a great teacher. And everybody in this room probably remembers a great teacher. My wife, Vicki, she hates it when I say this because somehow it indicates her age, but when she was in the first 3 grades, she attended what we call in Minnesota country school. What you might think of, and you would be correct, as a one-room schoolhouse out on the prairie. She grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota. Looks just like a little house on the prairie. And that teacher made all the difference in her life. Just loved her. And then a great traumatic event occurred. They had to close down the little country school, and she had to go to the big city of Houston, Minnesota, population 1,100, and go to the big school. Interestingly, when she moved to the big school, she was far ahead in reading than her counterparts who had started in the big school. Vicki went on to graduate through that system from the big school, and I just loved going to her class reunions. I think there were 48 people in her graduating class. There were 974 in mine. And it's amazing how close they get. But the inspiration, the challenge of that teacher has stuck with her all these years. In those days, you hired a good teacher and rewarded a good teacher, and kids loved the good teacher. Nowadays, sometimes you see a different circumstance. In my own district in Minnesota, there was an example of a superintendent told me the teacher who inspired his kids and developed an innovative method for getting them to read, did a fantastic job, was awarded Teacher of the Year, but he didn't get a raise, didn't get a promotion, he got fired. because he was the last hired. That system's got to change. It's got to change. So we, in crafting our bills, have put some hope in there, I think, for good teachers. We want to see them rewarded, not fired. Under the current law, there is this provision called highly qualified teacher. Who can be against that? Everybody wants a highly qualified teacher. But it turns out, though, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're a good teacher, that you can actually teach kids, that you can inspire kids, that they can succeed. It means you've got degrees and certificates and so forth. We take that out and encourage schools to reward their good teachers. Well, I probably have some more pages here. I do have some more pages. It all tells you sorts of things that you already know. Wow, this is a little bit upsetting. Here, I just saw it. This fact always gets my attention when I looked at it. Did you know that the 2011 GA report revealed more than 80 distinct federal programs designed to help improve teacher quality? 80. The president wants 81.
How many are good?
Ah, there's the question. How many have even been evaluated? Very few. $4 billion on these programs. $4 billion. We need to change the system. We're trying to change the system. Thank you for being here, for your interest, for your dedication. Thanks to AEI for inviting us and opening the place up. And now I've reached that really scary part of the day when we do questions and answers, and I think Rick was going to start. He's teed them up. He's got all the hard ones. The rest of you can just relax.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got a little bit of time, so let me throw a couple out here just to get us started. First, if you were to identify a couple of key things that NCLB got right, what are those?
Well, as I said, I think it was helpful to sort of unmask how schools were doing. There were too many cases where schools were saying, well, 95% of our kids are doing great. They're graduating. They can read and they can write. But consistently and persistently, the same 5% was not doing well. And that's getting at that no child left behind. We found out that there were groups of minority students, for example, who were consistently not doing well. And so I think that was helpful. It was useful to say we need some accountability measures there, and schools need to be held accountable for it. And so I think that was a success, and we've tried to retain that. But as my friend, and he is my friend, although we disagree on just about everything, George Miller. In fact, we just know that when we go down the floor, if I voted green, he's going to vote red, and vice versa. But nevertheless, he and I, we've spent an awful lot of time talking about this, and one of the questions he asked, which I think is fundamental to this, was not whether or not we should have accountability, but accountable to whom. And he was opining that, well, maybe it's not the Secretary of Education, maybe it is the parents and teachers and school boards and local governments. And we have tried to do that in this legislation. Not get rid of accountability, but sort of answer the question, accountable to whom.
So what do you say to supporters of No Child Left Behind, like the Education Trust, who have expressed concerns that those school boards will not actually hold the schools accountable, and so that your proposals amount to a retreat from NCLB's stance that we need to serve all kids better?
Well, they're wrong. Oh, you probably wanted more than that. No, we are not, again, we're not abandoning accountability. But what we found is when the federal government does it, it's a one-size-fits-all, then immediately it runs into problems that don't fit. Perhaps a rural school doesn't fit a rural school, doesn't fit, same condition doesn't fit an urban school or a suburban school. We think those decisions are better made in the states, but we insist that they have an accountability system. and that they enforce the accountability system. We want them to fix schools that are failing. We just don't think it's appropriate to set up the sort of structure where I think the Secretary and the Senate have this notion, well, we'll just sort of pick 5% of schools. 5%. Well, why wasn't it 4 or 7 or 6? Well, 5% of schools, and you have to do these things when you turn those around. That's way, way too prescriptive. You need to identify schools that aren't stepping up to the plate and go and help them, but you don't need the Secretary of Education of the U.S. Congress telling you what you need to do, because it simply won't work in some places. I hate to be flip about this, but sometimes I find myself being so that, you're told you've got to fire the principal or you've got to fire half the teachers, and so you live in a little town in LeSueur County, Minnesota, and so what do? They're fired from this end of the building, they go to that end. There's no people there. There've got to be other ways to address these issues, and you can't govern that from Washington.
One question that's been raised from the other side is that between the bills that you introduced last year and most of what you're rolling out today, it reduces the federal footprint. The one thing that seems distinctive there is the teacher quality language, which seems in some ways to envision a more ambitious federal role. How do you think about that?
We've just taken a different approach. As I mentioned earlier, the No Child Left Behind has this very prescriptive, highly qualified teacher requirement that we think doesn't address the issue at all, because it's measuring all the wrong things. And so we've taken that out entirely, unlike the Senate bill, and encouraged, insisted, if you will, that the states and localities develop teacher evaluation systems which have a component of student achievement. What that looks like, they do. We don't want to prescribe that, nor proscribe that. But we don't want to prescribe that from Washington and let them develop it. But we do think it's important that they look at ways to make sure that they're rewarding the really good teachers so that their kids, our kids, your kids and grandkids have experiences like my wife's and not otherwise.
One of the things that your bill, that one of the bills introduces, is it addresses maintenance of effort, which is a place where few folks dare to tread. Do you want to say a couple words about what the proposal is and why it was incorporated? Well,
maintenance of effort is in place, and that requires that states spend no less than what they've spent already, roughly put. We don't think it's the job of the federal government to tell states how they should spend money. And there's a couple of things wrong with that maintenance of effort. One is it presumes that if you keep spending more money, things are just going to get better. Well, I don't know where the evidence for that would come from. So the states need to be allowed to make adjustments to their budget without the federal government telling them what they have to do. So we have removed that requirement, and there is a great wailing and gnashing of teeth that we have heard, because shockingly not everybody agrees with my judgment on that, because there is certainly an element out there that says you just have to spend more money. The more money you spend, the better you get, although piles and piles of data say that's not so. You've got graphs. Usually we have graphs to show how much money we've spent and student achievement, and no. So it works on the wrong premise, and it is a huge intercession of the federal government. The states are dealing all the time with their budget requirements. Most of them are required by their constitutions to have balanced budgets. They need to be able to set their priorities, and they need to be able to have the latitude to find better ways to improve education and not just presume that you're going to keep spending more money. But there are those who think that if the federal government doesn't insist on it, then states will not spend the money, and so they need the cover of the federal government. And I understand their argument, but I don't think it's the right thing to do.
And I'm sure in some of your conversations, Congressman Miller has expressed concerns that states will take Title I dollars otherwise and just use them to plug holes and then move those dollars into more politically influential parts of town.
Yeah.
How do you guard against that kind of risk?
Have you been talking to him here? Yeah, I have heard some of that. We do a couple things in this whole thing. We make sure that we keep the supplement, not supplant provision, that you can't take money, state money out and replace it with federal money. It's got to be additive. We do fence Title I money in this bill more than we did in our funding flexibility bill earlier. Still a lot of flexibility. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard from superintendents very clearly put, I've got money here, I don't need it here. I don't have money here. Why can't I move this money from here to here? So we're continuing to try to do that. We did that in our funding flexibility bill that we passed last spring. And now we've provided some fence, if you will, around Title I, but we still want to grant as much flexibility as possible.
You know, last week at a conversation we had around the shape of 2012 reform, one of Duncan's assistant secretaries, Peter Cunningham, said, boy, I wish the folks in the House would talk to Republican state chiefs because they're excited about you know, an aggressive federal profile here, that it provides them the firepower and support they need to drive change. Do you agree with Peter on that, or what's your take on that question?
Is it must be about time to leave? No, it's been an interesting thing. I have great respect for a lot of the Republican chiefs, or the people, and not just state chiefs, but you got everybody from the mayor of Los Angeles, who is not only not a state chief, is not a Republican, but you've got people all across the country who have looked at the situation. They know those little questions I was asking at the beginning. They know that their kids are not doing better. They know that they've got graduation rates less than half, and in some places like Los Angeles, a good example, is just dismal hope for those kids. And so they are stepping up to do a change. You mentioned, I think, Scandera and Bennett and others, and I'm very proud of them. They really stepped up to do change. But sometimes these folks, you know, they don't want the federal government. They want to do everything they want to do, without the federal government getting in the way, but they want cover, if you will. I don't, everybody sort of stand, gosh, I really didn't want to have to fire all those teachers, but the doggone federal government made me do it. Well, I can't do everything. I think that the wonderful reform movement that is out there, and I think some really, really positive things are happening, needs to continue. I want the federal government not to get in the way, but you can't have just that exact amount of intrusion that you want. And what I told a group of school board members, they were in town by the thousands this week. No, that's a good thing. There were not 1,000 in my office. There were a lot from Minnesota. But I said, look, you're not going to get everything you want in this bill. Nobody. It's my bill. I don't get everything I want. Nobody's going to get everything they want in this bill. What we're trying to do is make sure that our kids have the best chance to succeed, get the best education possible, involve parents more, give them more options, more choices, more say, more input, more involvement and control at the local level, and a much smaller federal footprint. That's what we think we've done in this legislation. And so, yes, some of the state school chiefs wish I would have put a little bit more in there that would allow them to say it's the federal government making me do it, but I think they're going to do the right things. They're really doing some very good work out there. Some people have taken huge political challenges. The mayor of Los Angeles took on the teachers union, who were his biggest supporters, and so I told him, he came to my office and he said, well, Mr. Chairman, I'm a Democrat. And I said, I know, you're sort of a Democrat's Democrat, but you're my hero. You're really taking on a terrible mess and trying to make it right. That's
great. One last question, and let's go ahead and open it up. give you a chance to play prognosticator if you wish. What's the likelihood that the bill is going to make it out of the House, that this will make it through the House?
That really is time to leave. Look, this is a presidential election year, and some of you may have just tuned on the TV, but there have been some signs of that out there for a while now. And so that makes it tougher. There's no question about it. And we knew that coming in. As the language has gotten tougher and tougher, the rhetoric on all sides has gotten tougher, it makes it harder. But the imperative for fixing the law remains. And both sides know that. R's and D's, House and Senate know that. The White House knows that. The waiver program has done a couple of things. Unfortunately, it's taken a little bit of the steam, a little bit of the pressure to get reform done. It's eased that a little bit, but it's only temporary. The law is still the law. We've got to fix the law. We're going to press on. We are going to, as I said, we're going to introduce the bills today. We're going to have a hearing next week. We'll be marking them up in committee in a couple of 2 or 3 weeks. I don't have the date there. And we'll move it through. My crystal ball is a little bit muddy these days, but I think it's important that we do this, and I do think there's continued agreement that you have to fix the law, so we'll press and see how far it goes.
Okay, let's go ahead and open it up. We'll have a couple of mics coming around. Please catch Whitney or Daniel's eye. 2 requests. 1, please be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation. 2, if you get about 15 or 20 seconds in and I don't spot a question, we're going to go ahead and give somebody else a chance. What?
Hi, Mr. Chairman.
Hi.
Allison Kline, Education Week.
Indeed
nice
you
to
are.
see you. Yeah. 2 questions. One, piggybacking on something that Rick asked you about. He mentioned that over on the Senate side, they don't have the teacher evaluation language in their bill. And I'm sure, as you know, it was actually Republicans, Senator Alexander, Senator Enzi, who pushed for that. I was wondering if you can kind of comment there on the politics of that. And then my other question is, why did you all get rid of the school improvement grant program? I know there's a lot of folks who aren't big fans of the 4 models, but a lot of districts and states want to get those resources, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, talking about the politics of that remains to be seen. I mean, I think some of the Republicans in the Senate were reluctant to have any federal intrusion at all into the teacher business. You mentioned Lamar Alexander. They also want teachers to good teachers to be rewarded and have a mechanism for bad teachers. So there's some room for some discussion there as we go forward, and we'll just see how that plays out. We think in our legislation that we have provided the proper impetus to do some performance evaluation and make sure there is some connection to student achievement, to make sure that this is involved in the human resources, personnel management part of it, but we're not prescriptive at all, and I think there's room for discussion there. We have taken things like school improvement grants. We have bundled. It's not that you can't do things for school improvement. You could, for example, have tutoring or something. We've just broken up the straws and put them together into a couple of bigger tubes. And I think that's a reflection of what we were trying to do in the funding flexibility bill that we moved through the committee. And I was surprised, I hate to admit that, show any naivete at all, but I was surprised that we had the partisan resistance to that we got, because I thought that it made sense that you ought to be able to spend the money where it will do the most good for your school, but there was some disagreement. Just like I was surprised when we decided to eliminate about half of the programs, many of which hadn't been funded for a long time. There was just stuff sitting out there. Why wouldn't we clean all that up? Well, it turns out that every one of those programs has a mom or dad in Congress. So,
Daniel. Rich?
Morning, sir. Reggie Felton, National School Boards Association.
Yes, sir. Good morning.
We're glad you did meet with them, and they appreciate your comments. Our comments have to do with, again, both the maintenance of effort and the increases appropriations tied to CPI. We're concerned that the maintenance of effort issue could be eliminated for education, but not other industries or other categories, and therefore locally, where they exist, education funding could be taken away to support others where it has not been eliminated. And secondly, the CPI is tied currently, the authorization increases are tied to CPI, and we're concerned that there may be other indices that are just as effective if you do that. We believe that tying it to anything sort of takes away the authority members of Congress have. Would you like to comment on those?
I guess I have to. I don't know. Look, the authorization levels, let me just sort of take a blanket look at that. We're facing a situation, as everybody in this room knows, where the federal government is borrowing 42 cents on every dollar it spends. We're now 3 years in a row of running deficits of over $1 trillion. We've got a debt now that exceeds, ever so slightly exceeds, gross domestic product for the first time. We have got a financial train wreck that we are trying to grapple with. So when we as a body look at every single program, there is enormous pressure to cut spending. And so our approach was to take the appropriated level, last appropriated level, I'm looking way back there, get my glasses on, that's correct, and then run it across. And I don't know about the indexing for inflation. I don't know how that's arrived at. And there is an effort now, as you know, to change how all of that is done, even by the Congressional Budget Office. So the baseline, we had a bill that came through the House the other day, isn't adjusted by inflation, and you work it in nominal terms. And then I've already mentioned, the maintenance of effort, the states really need to have the latitude to make the decisions that they want to make. And I think they'll make the right decisions. They don't need the federal government telling them that they can't spend less money. We believe that's really an inappropriate role for the federal government to tell the states how much money they have to spend.
Whitney?
That on? Okay. Mr. Chairman, Tom Luna from Idaho, I'm one of those Republican chiefs that was mentioned earlier.
And I'm embarrassed because I knew you were here, and I should have thrown your name out there first.
No, that's fine.
Left Bennett and Scandair and those guys out. Yeah, go ahead.
Appreciate this bill and appreciate your work. In reference to your comments just a moment ago about the reality that the federal government has to get the budget under control, I would just hope that the reality, and I think most chiefs understand that the funding for education at the federal level will probably go down, so more flexibility is key. I'm convinced that we can do more with the dollars we have with more flexibility, and I think your bill goes towards that. And then my question is about Common Core. Having been one of those that was at the table at the very beginning where states have worked together to develop Common Core, I think it's important that Common Core never be a mandate in order to receive formula funding or competitive to compete for federal grants, and that Common Core continue to be a state-led effort and not a requirement to receive any federal dollars. And I was wanting your comments on that.
I couldn't agree more.
Great.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I do not want the federal government to get in the way of any state who wants to get together with any other state and say, look, we ought to develop something here in common. We've got these standards, let's get together, we can develop this assessment. That's up to the states to do that. What I don't want is those decisions to be made by Washington, either dictated in law by us or by the Secretary of Education. So I think a lot of good things are going on out there, but I don't want, and our bills don't require, that you adopt Common Core standards or any other common standard or assessment, because those are decisions you need to make.
My point was there going to be any language in your bill that would prohibit the Secretary or the Department from requiring
Ah, yes. The answer is yes. I mean, we were careful, having the current experience of waivers in front of us, where the secretary says, I will grant the waiver, I will give you money, I will do these things if you do what I want to do. We proscribe that in our bill.
And do you specifically speak to the question of curriculum or standards?
We certainly don't proscribe anybody going to Common Core or standards, nor do we prescribe exactly what you have to do. We say you got to have standards, and you've got to have an accountability system and an assessment system, but we don't tell you what it is.
Dan?
There's a microphone rapidly approaching.
Hi, Joel Packer with the Raven Group and the Committee for Education Funding. While you're following up on Reggie's question, your bill sets the authorization levels at the current appropriations levels and then provides for inflation increases. However, unless Congress acts in January of 2013, all these programs are going to be cut by 9% from sequestration. So several Republicans, your former chairman, Congressman McKeon, have put in a bill to try to protect defense programs from cuts, and curious what your view is about sequestration, how that impacts education, and what Congress might be able to do to prevent these deep cuts in education.
That one really is too hard. And I mean it very seriously. The sequestration, sequestration is going to have a very bad effect on a lot of things. As mentioned, I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. The sequestration effect on defense is devastating. And so there is a lot of thought being given to how do we do something other than sequestration. I don't have the answer here in my pocket. I just have the terrible lump in my chest or in my gut that this is it's a really big problem. And then as you say, what does that affect? What effect does that have, sequestration, and how much money is appropriated in everything as we go forward? We're going to write a budget that works around that sequestration or abides by it? That's the very debate we're having right now.
What?
Mr. Chairman, my name is Bill Knudsen with CED. I had a question on technical assistance in the comprehensive centers to help local, local state educations and agencies and also school districts. How exactly are you going to ensure that any of the required federal TA that we have to accept? I used to be a program director for the District of Columbia Schools. We needed the TA desperately, but one of the frustrating things was that many, for our school improvement things, whether it's state or other interventions, we actually had people who had a theoretical understanding of the problem, but actually never worked in programs, and I've worked at the local and federal level in these programs, so they actually couldn't really help us. So I'd be curious, since I appreciate your desire for local control, how, if there is going to be TA provided and there are going to be these programs, and make sure people providing, especially for entities like the DC school system, I mean, they need a lot of help, make sure that the people helping us actually know what the heck they're doing. So thank you, sir.
Sounds like a fine idea, and I don't know the answer to your question. I know somebody who knows the answer to your question is sitting right back there, and I would encourage you to go back and talk to James or Brad or Lindsay. I don't know the answer to the question. So I see the problem. I don't know.
All right.
I hate it.
Dan?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Robert Mahaffey with the Rural School and Community Trust. Very much appreciate your wife's history in small rural schools.
Me too.
And looking at school consolidation. Congressman Thompson, Republican, Congressman Butterfield, a Democrat, have introduced H.R. 284-5 to look at Title I. And slowly over time to gradually eliminate number weighting into Title I. It's a very bipartisan bill. How will that move through your committee?
I think the answer is we've incorporated some of that into the version that you'll see come out today. And I don't know how precisely tied to that is. Again, I'm looking back to people who are changing that ink now, but we're obviously GT is, Glenn Thompson is a member of the committee, and we've been in some discussions with him. Many of us, me included, have rural districts, very rural districts. Some of my towns are 300 or 400 people, and we have reached out to GT, and in the versions that's being released, is it being released immediately or noon or whenever it's going to be released? You'll see some of that there.
Thank you.
Dan?
Mr. Chairman, James Arkin, Northwestern University Middle News Service. You talk a lot about giving flexibility to state and localities, yet I believe there was something in the draft legislation about capping the amount of federal spending on class size reduction. Can you talk about why you would include something to cap how much can be spent on class size reduction and how that provision could be enforced?
Yeah, I mean, much of the teacher effort in a lot of places has gone to hiring more teachers. You may, I'm underscoring the obvious a little bit here, but I've got to set the premise that the notion was for a long time that if you really want to fix things, you just got to have smaller class sizes. I mean, that was an article of faith, that it was, you know, if 30 kids, if you had 30 kids and you could just have 25, well, then it'd be okay. If you had 25, it'd be 20, it'd be okay. And then it turns out that there's really not a whole lot of data to support that. And if you ask anybody, any parent, would you rather your kid be in Miss Smith's class with 25 kids or Miss Jones's class with 15 kids? And they all know that Miss Smith is the teacher. They want the bigger class with the better teacher. And so we don't want funds diverted to that effort of just hiring teachers in this notion that if you get the class size down, everything is going to be better. What is better is when you get a really good teacher. Nothing makes more difference in the life and the future of our kids than if they have a good teacher. There's just, and there is, I don't have it here, there's tons of evidence to show that. And you know it yourself. In that example I just gave you, I was down in, forgive me for just a second here, but I was down visiting with my son and daughter-in-law and their kids, grandkids, and they had just moved. My son's in the Army, and they were transferred to Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. And got nothing, not saying anything. So I was talking to Kim, my daughter-in-law, and she was struggling for, you know, where to get to put the kids. I mean, it's amazing. They weren't even there for a week, and she already knew which teachers were the good teachers and which ones she wouldn't want to put her kids in no matter what. I mean, every parent who is at all involved and paying attention knows that. They want their kids to have the good teacher. And we want all of our kids to have the good teacher, not necessarily just a smaller classroom. So we did put some language in there. You caught us.
And Mr. Chairman, actually, just to elaborate, I mean, as somebody who is also very skeptical of class size reduction, and has also, you know, found that to be a less than popular view sometimes when talking about education improvement. Nonetheless, it does seem to be a bit at odds with the general effort to give state and local leaders more leeway in deciding how to spend those federal dollars. Can you just talk for a moment about how do you strike that balance in determining when to give leeway and when to maybe offer some restrictions?
Very carefully. We went back. We have to go back to our basic operating premise here, and that is that we have federal money that is being spent on education. Probably not going to be revisiting that basic assumption for some time. I remember, that's how old I am. I remember when I was in high school, that was the national debate question. Resolved that there should be federal aid to education. That was the national debate. I'm really old. That was, and I had to be able to debate both sides of it. Very, that's how that works in that debate deal. Interesting. So we've got federal money going. We've got a commitment there. We want some accountability for that money. We don't just throw it out there and say, good luck to you. So we're asking for accountability systems developed by states. We want the information. We've got money going to teachers and for teacher training and so forth. We want some visibility into that and some input into that. But in all cases, we want the overall effect to be more local control, more parental involvement, and less federal intrusion in how our schools are run. And so we're always, when you do legislation like this, you're always somewhere between the extremes of making the Secretary of Education the nation's superintendent and having no federal role. So I'm not really trying to duck the question, but that's, I mean, all the way through, that's what we're trying to thread.
Whitney, I think we have time probably for one more question.
Hi, I'm Jerome Dancis. I'm a retired college math professor. And the view from the colleges is that students are showing up knowing considerably less arithmetic than a decade ago and 2 decades ago. And are you aware that this is actually a result of federal money, because the federal government has been financing anti-arithmetic programs big time for the past 20 years, and that the bulk of the professional development money is being used on for these anti-arithmetic programs instead of teaching the teachers arithmetic, which many of them need.
Well, I know that a lot of the teacher programs have not produced what we wanted them to produce. I didn't realize there was actually an anti-arithmetic program, but I see people sitting back there I'm going to talk to about this on the way out of here. I do know that, and one more personal anecdote here, when I was in high school, as I mentioned before, it was a very large high school, 974 students in my graduating class, so I didn't get real close with a lot of them, but I took some, we called them accelerated courses back in those days. There were courses for the smart kids, and I tricked them a couple times into thinking I was a smart kid, and so I was taking advanced algebra, and I thought I really knew something about math, and I got to college. I went to a little private school in Texas, Rice University, and I walked in and I signed up for Math 100. How bad can that be, right? Math 100. And right away I walked in and there was a blackboard and there were these long skinny S's and funny looking little D's on there that I had never seen before. And a word that if I had heard it went right over my head. I said, well, welcome to Math 100. This is calculus. Really? So I needed to find out about that anti-arithmetic thing a little earlier, because it turned out that proved to be a fairly challenging course. But I do think, I just want to recap here, I think we're all have witnessed a system that is not moving in the direction we want it to move to. These graduation rates are appalling. The fact that we have kids graduating high school and going to college, and they immediately have to start getting remedial education. We have a problem here. We're not competing well against other nations worldwide, and I don't think the answer to that is stronger, larger, bigger federal intervention. I think we have the evidence to prove that doesn't work. We have put together some legislation which I think strikes that balance of some accountability to parents and teachers and local districts and to the taxpayer, and giving impetus to the reform movement that has, I think, is proven to be very successful in catching hold in states from California to Idaho to Indiana to Florida to New Mexico and wherever else I've skipped in this thing. There's really good stuff going out there, and we want those reforms to continue. Thanks for your interest in this. Thanks for your attention today. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.